the scorching summer of 1874, in the small Georgia town of Millbrook, population approximately 450 people, a physician named Dr. Marcus Webb documented the beginning of what would become one of the most disturbing medical disasters in post-Civil War America. Over the course of 18 months, 217 residents of Millbrook, nearly half the town's population, would lose their vision in a progressive pattern of blindness that began with minor visual disturbances and ended in complete and permanent loss of sight. The cause would eventually be traced to the town's primary water source, a well that had been contaminated with a substance that slowly and irreversibly destroyed the optic nerves of those who consumed it regularly. What made the Millbrook blindness particularly tragic was not just the scale of the disaster, but the fact that it developed slowly enough that the pattern went unrecognized until it was too late to prevent most of the cases. The first victims experienced subtle changes in their vision that seemed minor and were attributed to normal variations in eyesight or to the effects of aging. Only when the number of affected residents reached critical mass did physicians recognize that they were dealing with a systematic poisoning that had been occurring for months, affecting entire families, devastating the community's ability to function, and creating a population of blind people who had no training or preparation for navigating the world without sight. The disaster would also reveal troubling questions about community water supplies, about the difficulty of identifying slow-acting toxins, and about how vulnerable populations could be to environmental hazards that developed gradually rather than suddenly. Millbrook became a town of the blind, a community forced to completely restructure itself to accommodate the massive number of residents who had lost their vision, creating new forms of social organization and support that had never been necessary before the contamination occurred. By the time the source of the blindness was identified and the contaminated well was closed in early 1876, the damage had been done. 217 people, ranging in age from young children to the elderly, had been permanently blinded. Families had been devastated, with some households losing the vision of all members. The town's economy had collapsed, as workers could no longer perform their jobs and businesses closed for lack of customers and employees. Millbrook became known throughout Georgia and beyond as the Blind Town, a place marked by tragedy and serving as a warning about the dangers of contaminated water supplies. Before we continue with the devastating story of Millbrook, Georgia, and the contaminated water that blinded half the town's population, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. Millbrook, Georgia, in 1874, was a small agricultural town located in the central part of the state, about 40 miles south of Macon. The town had been established in the 1840s and had grown slowly but steadily as farming families settled in the region to take advantage of the fertile soil and moderate climate that allowed for cotton, corn, and vegetable production. The Civil War had been devastating to the area, as it had been to most of Georgia, with Union troops passing through during Sherman's march to the sea in 1864, burning much of the town and destroying infrastructure that took years to rebuild. By 1874, Millbrook had recovered somewhat from the war's destruction, though the economic disruptions of Reconstruction continued to create challenges. The population was mixed, consisting of white farming families, freed black families who had remained in the area after emancipation, or who had migrated from other regions seeking land and opportunities, and a small number of merchants and professionals who served the agricultural community. Relations between white and black residents were tense, as they were throughout the South during Reconstruction, but the town had avoided the worst violence that plagued some communities, maintaining an uneasy peace through a combination of social segregation and economic interdependence. The town's primary water source was a large public well located in the center of the community, near the town square, where the general store, church, and a few other businesses were clustered. The well had been dug in 1848 and had served the community reliably for over 25 years, providing water that was generally considered clean and safe. Most residents drew their water directly from this well, carrying it home in buckets or barrels for drinking, cooking, and washing. A few wealthier families had private wells on their properties, but the vast majority of Millbrook's population depended on the central public well for all their water needs. No one questioned the safety of this water. It tasted normal, looked clear, and had never been associated with any illnesses or problems. The well was maintained by a town committee that periodically cleaned it and ensured that debris didn't contaminate the water supply. By all appearances, it was a safe and reliable water source, no different from thousands of similar wells serving small towns throughout the South. The first case of vision problems that would eventually be recognized as part of the larger pattern occurred in February of 1874, when a woman named Sarah Mitchell, age 37, consulted Dr. Webb about increasing difficulty with her eyesight. She described seeing halos around lights, particularly at night, and experiencing occasional blurring of vision that made reading difficult. Dr. Webb examined her eyes and found nothing obviously wrong, attributing her symptoms to normal age-related changes in vision that commonly began in people's 30s and 40s. He advised her to rest her eyes more frequently, and to ensure she had adequate lighting when doing close work like sewing or reading. Over the following months, several other residents consulted Dr. Webb with similar complaints. A farmer named Thomas Green reported that his distance vision seemed to be declining, making it difficult to see clearly across his fields. A young woman named Elizabeth Carter mentioned that colors seemed less vibrant than they had been, that everything looked slightly faded or washed out. A merchant named Robert Harris described difficulty adjusting between bright sunlight and the dimmer interior of his store, saying that his eyes seemed to take much longer than normal to adapt to changing light conditions. Dr. Webb documented these cases, but initially saw no pattern connecting them. Vision problems were common, and the symptoms his patients described seemed to fall within the normal range of variations in eyesight that he encountered regularly in his practice. Some people naturally had better vision than others, and most people experienced some decline in visual acuity as they aged. What he was observing seemed unremarkable, just the ordinary complaints that any physician in a small town would expect to encounter. But by late spring of 1874, the number of patients reporting vision problems had increased to the point where Dr. Webb began to suspect that something unusual might be occurring. He had now seen 23 different patients with various visual complaints over a 4-month period, a much higher rate than he would normally expect in a town of Millbrook's size. More concerning was that several of the patients he had seen initially were returning with reports that their symptoms were worsening despite his advice and treatments. Sarah Mitchell, who had first consulted him in February, returned in May reporting that the halos around lights had become constant and that she was now experiencing difficulty seeing clearly even in good light. Her vision had deteriorated significantly in just 3 months, progressing from minor complaints to substantial impairment. Webb conducted a more thorough examination and discovered that her pupils were responding sluggishly to light, a sign that something might be affecting her optic nerves or the neural pathways that processed visual information. Alarmed by this finding, Dr. Webb began systematically examining all the patients who had consulted him about vision problems, testing their pupil responses, their ability to distinguish colors, their field of vision, and other basic visual functions. What he found was deeply troubling. Nearly all of them showed evidence of progressive optic nerve damage, with sluggish pupil responses, narrowing visual fields, and declining color perception that suggested their optic nerves were being systematically destroyed by some unknown cause. Dr. Webb had never encountered anything like this in his medical career. Optic nerve damage could result from various causes, including trauma, infection, tumors, or certain diseases, but none of these explanations seemed to fit the pattern he was observing. The affected patients showed no signs of head injury, no symptoms of infections that might cause nerve damage, and no evidence of the systemic diseases that sometimes affected vision. Yet their optic nerves were clearly degenerating, and the process seemed to be continuing, despite all his efforts to halt or reverse it. By July of 1874, the number of affected residents had grown to 57, and Dr. Webb recognized that he was dealing with something far beyond his ability to manage alone. He wrote to colleagues in Macon and Atlanta, describing the cases and asking for advice about possible causes and treatments. He also began keeping detailed records of every patient with vision problems, documenting their symptoms, the progression of their visual decline, and any factors that might be common among them that could provide clues about the cause. It was through this systematic documentation that Dr. Webb finally identified the pattern that would lead to understanding the source of the problem. When he reviewed his patient records and interviewed affected residents about their daily routines, he discovered that nearly all of them drew their water primarily from the central public well. The few families who had private wells, and who used those wells as their primary water source, had experienced no vision problems. This correlation was too strong to be coincidental, and it suggested that something in the public well water was causing the progressive blindness affecting so many residents. Dr. Webb immediately had the well water tested by a chemist in Macon, sending several samples for analysis. The initial results came back showing that the water contained elevated levels of various dissolved minerals, but nothing that seemed obviously toxic or dangerous. The chemist suggested that the mineral content was higher than ideal but probably not harmful for most purposes. Dr. Webb was not satisfied with this conclusion, as it didn't explain the devastating pattern of blindness he was observing. He pressed for more detailed analysis, asking the chemist to look specifically for any substances that might affect the nervous system or optic nerves. The second round of testing, completed in September of 1874, revealed the presence of a lead compound in the water, specifically lead acetate, at concentrations that were low enough to be tasteless and odorless, but high enough to cause cumulative toxic effects with regular consumption over time. Lead acetate was known to be toxic, and there was some medical literature suggesting it could affect vision, though the specific mechanism by which it damaged optic nerves was not well understood in the 1870s. What was clear was that chronic exposure to even small amounts of lead could cause serious neurological damage, and that the optic nerves were particularly vulnerable to lead toxicity. Dr. Webb now understood what had been happening to his patients. They had been slowly poisoning themselves by drinking water from the contaminated well, consuming small doses of lead acetate with every glass of water, every cup of coffee or tea, every meal cooked with the contaminated water. The lead had accumulated in their bodies over months, gradually reaching levels high enough to damage their optic nerves. The process was insidious because the damage developed slowly, beginning with subtle symptoms that seemed minor and only progressing to obvious impairment after months of exposure. The immediate question was how the lead had gotten into the well water. Dr. Webb organized an investigation of the well itself, having it drained so that the shaft and surrounding area could be examined. What they discovered was both simple and tragic. Approximately 50 feet from the well, partially buried and largely forgotten, was an old ammunition dump from the Civil War, a site where Confederate forces had buried damaged artillery shells and other ordnance when they abandoned the area in 1864. Over the 10 years since the war, Rainwater had gradually leached lead from the buried shells and carried it through the soil into the aquifer that fed the public well. The contamination had been occurring slowly but steadily, with lead concentrations in the water gradually increasing over time. By the time the source was identified and the well was closed in October of 1874, 103 residents had already developed significant vision problems, and many more were beginning to show early symptoms. The damage that had already occurred was irreversible. Lead-induced optic nerve damage was permanent, and there were no treatments available that could restore lost vision. The affected residents would be blind for the rest of their lives, their visual impairment, a permanent consequence of drinking water that had seemed safe, but had been slowly poisoning them for months. The town was thrown into crisis, with over 100 residents already blind or rapidly losing their vision. Millbrook faced enormous challenges in continuing to function as a community. Farmers who could no longer see couldn't work their fields. Merchants who had lost their vision couldn't run their businesses. Families where multiple members had been affected faced the prospect of having no one with sight to help navigate daily tasks or provide income. The social and economic fabric of the town was being torn apart by the mass disabling event, and no one knew how to address the scale of the problem. Dr. Webb worked frantically to identify all residents who had consumed significant amounts of water from the contaminated well, hoping to predict who else might develop blindness, and to provide some warning that might allow them to prepare. His analysis suggested that anyone who had been drinking primarily from the public well for 6 months or more was at high risk of developing optic nerve damage, and that those who had been using the well for a year or more had almost certainly been exposed to enough lead to cause permanent vision loss even if symptoms hadn't yet appeared. This grim prediction proved accurate. Over the following months, more and more residents who had seemed fine initially began to develop the telltale signs of progressive blindness. By January of 1875, the number of affected residents had reached 157. By April, it was 183. The wave of blindness continued to roll through the community as accumulated lead in people's bodies finally reached the threshold where optic nerve damage became apparent. The progression followed a consistent pattern. It typically began with subtle changes that patients initially dismissed or attributed to fatigue or eye strain. They might notice slight blurring around the edges of their vision, or difficulty seeing in low light conditions, or a general sense that colors seemed less vivid. These early symptoms would persist for weeks, gradually worsening until the patient recognized that something was seriously wrong and sought medical attention. By that point, significant damage had already occurred, and the visual decline would continue despite any interventions. The middle stage involved more obvious impairment. Patients described their vision as if looking through a fog, or as if there was a gray film over everything they saw. Reading became difficult or impossible. Recognizing faces required being very close to the person. Navigating unfamiliar spaces became challenging as depth perception and peripheral vision deteriorated. This stage could last for weeks or months, with the affected person experiencing steadily increasing disability as more and more of their visual capacity was lost. The final stage was complete blindness. The progressive damage to the optic nerves eventually reached the point where no visual information was being transmitted from the eyes to the brain. Patients described the world going dark gradually, like a light being slowly dimmed until it finally went out entirely. The psychological impact of watching themselves lose their vision incrementally, knowing the process was irreversible, and that they would spend the rest of their lives in darkness, was devastating. Many affected residents experienced profound depression, and several attempted suicide rather than face life without sight. Dr. Webb found himself providing not just medical care, but psychological support to a community traumatized by mass disability. He organized meetings where affected residents could share their experiences and fears, where they could learn from each other about how to begin adapting to blindness, where they could find some comfort in shared experience and mutual support. He also worked with religious leaders in the community to provide spiritual counseling and to help residents find meaning and hope in circumstances that seemed overwhelmingly dark. The practical challenges of suddenly having such a large blind population were enormous. Millbrook had no institutions or resources designed to help blind people learn to navigate without sight. There were no schools for the blind nearby, no trained teachers who could instruct residents in techniques for managing daily tasks without vision, no established systems of support for people who had lost their sight. Everything had to be improvised by a community that was itself struggling with the disaster and had limited resources to address it. Some residents who had retained their vision stepped forward to help, organizing systems of support where sighted community members would assist blind neighbors with tasks that required vision. They helped blind farmers continue to work their land by providing visual guidance during planting and harvesting. They helped blind merchants adapt their businesses by serving as their eyes and hands in conducting transactions. They escorted blind residents to church, to town meetings, to social gatherings, ensuring that those who had lost their vision were not also isolated from community life. Other community members responded differently, seeing the mass blindness as a judgment or curse and distancing themselves from affected families. Some residents who had the means to do so left Millbrook entirely, relocating to other communities where they wouldn't have to witness the ongoing tragedy or deal with its consequences. The town's population began to decline as families departed, further weakening the social and economic structures that remained. The state of Georgia, when it finally became aware of the disaster in Millbrook, provided some limited assistance. Officials arranged for several teachers from the Georgia Academy for the Blind to visit Millbrook and provide basic instruction in techniques for navigating without sight, for reading and writing using tactile methods, and for adapting homes and workspaces to be more accessible for blind residents. This help was valuable but inadequate, given the scale of the need. The teachers could spend only a few weeks in Millbrook, could work with only a fraction of the affected population, and could provide only introductory instruction in skills that took months or years to develop fully. Financial assistance was also minimal. Some charitable organizations provided small grants to help affected families purchase equipment or make modifications to their homes, but there was no systematic government support for people who had been disabled by the water contamination. Affected residents were largely left to manage on their own, to figure out how to earn a living without sight, to adapt their homes and lifestyles as best they could, with limited resources and support. The legal questions raised by the disaster were also complex and largely unresolved. Who was responsible for the contamination? Could residents sue for compensation for their lost vision? The lead had come from military ordnance left behind by Confederate forces, but those forces no longer existed as an organization that could be held accountable. The town had maintained the well and had failed to detect the contamination, but the town government had limited resources and had acted without knowledge that the water was dangerous. The chemists who had initially tested the water and declared it acceptable had used the best methods available in the 1870s, but those methods had been inadequate to detect the specific contaminant that was causing the problem. Several affected residents did file lawsuits, but these legal actions produced little concrete result. Courts were uncertain about how to assign liability for a disaster that seemed to have no clear culprit, that resulted from circumstances no one had anticipated or controlled. Most cases were dismissed or settled for small amounts that did nothing to compensate for the life-altering consequences of blindness. The legal system of the 1870s simply wasn't equipped to handle mass toxic exposure cases, and Millbrook's residents found little justice or compensation through legal channels. By the end of 1875, the wave of new blindness cases had finally slowed, and then stopped as the contaminated well had been closed long enough that residents who had avoided serious exposure were no longer at risk. The final count of affected residents was 217 out of a pre-disaster population of approximately 450 people. Nearly half the town's population had been permanently blinded by water that had seemed safe to drink, water that had been used without question for generations, water that had betrayed the trust that communities place in their basic resources. The demographics of the affected population revealed some troubling patterns. Families with lower incomes, who had depended entirely on the public well and had consumed water from it for all purposes, were affected at higher rates than wealthier families who had private wells or who purchased bottled water for drinking. Children were affected at higher rates than adults, possibly because their developing nervous systems were more vulnerable to lead toxicity, or because they consumed more water relative to their body weight. Women were affected at slightly higher rates than men, possibly because they spent more time at home and consumed more water prepared from the contaminated source for cooking and household tasks. These patterns meant that the disaster fell most heavily on those least able to manage its consequences. Poor families who had relied on children's labor to help with farming or other work now found those children unable to contribute, while still needing care and support. Women who had managed households and contributed to family income through domestic work like sewing or laundry found themselves unable to perform these tasks without sight. The families who had been most economically vulnerable before the disaster were devastated by it, pushed into poverty from which many would never escape. The long-term effects on the town were profound and lasting. Millbrook's economy collapsed as businesses closed and farming operations failed. The population continued to decline as families left seeking opportunities elsewhere and as potential new residents avoided a town known for the blindness disaster. By 1880, just 6 years after the contamination was discovered, Millbrook's population had fallen to fewer than 200 people, less than half its pre-disaster size. The town that remained was dramatically different from what it had been, a community restructured around the reality that a large portion of its residents were blind. Those blind residents who remained in Millbrook developed their own social structures and support systems. They formed organizations for mutual assistance, pooling resources and labor to help each other manage tasks that were difficult or impossible for blind individuals working alone. They advocated for modifications to public spaces that would make the town more navigable for people without sight, successfully lobbying for consistent placement of obstacles and landmarks that could be used for orientation. They created their own social networks that provided connection and community for people who shared the experience of blindness and the trauma of having lost their vision together. Dr. Marcus Webb continued to serve Millbrook throughout the disaster and its aftermath, though the experience took a severe toll on him personally. He felt tremendous guilt about not recognizing the pattern of blindness earlier, about not identifying the contaminated well before so many people had been affected. He questioned his medical judgment, wondering whether he should have been more suspicious when the first cases appeared, whether better diagnostic skills or more aggressive investigation might have saved some of the vision that was lost. His journals from this period reveal a physician tormented by the magnitude of the disaster and by his perceived failure to prevent it, even though no physician of his era would likely have performed better given the limitations of medical knowledge and diagnostic tools available in the 1870s. Webb's documentation of the Millbrook disaster became an important medical and public health resource. His detailed case studies of lead poisoning and optic nerve damage contributed to medical understanding of how toxic substances affected vision. His analysis of how the contamination had occurred and had gone undetected for so long provided lessons for water safety that influenced public health practices. His observations about the social and psychological impacts of mass disability helped establish frameworks for understanding how communities respond to catastrophic events that affect large numbers of people simultaneously. The disaster also attracted attention from researchers interested in blindness and in how people adapt to vision loss. Several physicians and scientists visited Millbrook in the late 1870s and 1880s to study the affected population, to document their adaptations and coping strategies, and to understand the long-term effects of sudden blindness on individuals and communities. This research contributed to the development of better methods for teaching blind people to navigate and function independently, methods that would eventually be incorporated into formal schools and training programs for the blind. Some of the Millbrook residents who had been blinded became advocates for blind people more broadly, using their experiences to argue for better support systems and accommodations. Several traveled to other communities to speak about their experiences and to demonstrate techniques they had developed for managing without sight. A few became involved in efforts to establish schools for the blind in Georgia and other southern states, contributing their practical knowledge to programs designed to help blind people develop skills and achieve independence. But many of the affected residents never fully adapted to their blindness, never found ways to live satisfying or productive lives without sight. They remained dependent on family members or community charity, unable to work or contribute economically, struggling with depression and loss of purpose that came from no longer being able to function as they once had. The psychological impact of sudden blindness, particularly blindness that resulted from a preventable contamination rather than from disease or accident, was profound and lasting. Many affected residents described feeling angry about their lost vision, feeling betrayed by authorities who should have ensured their water was safe, feeling abandoned by a society that provided minimal support for people who had been disabled through no fault of their own. The children who had been blinded faced particular challenges. They had lost their vision at ages when they should have been developing skills and preparing for adult lives. Their education was disrupted or ended entirely, as there were no local schools equipped to teach blind students. Their social development was affected by the difficulty of forming relationships when they couldn't see others' faces or expressions. Their career prospects were severely limited, as most occupations available in rural Georgia in the 1870s required vision. Many of these children spent their entire lives in Millbrook, never developing the independence or opportunities they might have had if they had retained their sight. The families who had multiple blind members faced the most difficult circumstances. In some households, both parents had been blinded along with one or more children, leaving no one in the family with vision to provide necessary assistance. These families became almost entirely dependent on community support, unable to function independently. The strain of managing these households was enormous, both for the blind family members and for the sighted community members who tried to help. Some of these families eventually separated, with blind members moving to institutions or to live with relatives elsewhere, as the challenge of keeping the household together became overwhelming. The Millbrook disaster also raised important questions about water safety and public health oversight that would influence practices throughout the United States. The fact that such severe contamination could persist undetected for months, affecting hundreds of people before anyone recognized a pattern, revealed how vulnerable communities were to environmental hazards in an era before systematic water testing and quality control. The disaster contributed to growing awareness that water supplies needed regular monitoring, that communities couldn't simply assume their water was safe without testing, and that public health required active surveillance and intervention rather than passive acceptance of traditional practices. The specific vulnerability of water supplies to lead contamination also became more widely recognized following the Millbrook disaster. Lead had been commonly used in plumbing, in ammunition, in various industrial processes, and the metal could leach into water supplies from multiple sources. The Millbrook case demonstrated that even old buried sources of lead could continue to contaminate water for years or decades, and that the effects of chronic low-level exposure could be devastating even when the contamination was not immediately obvious or detectable by taste or appearance. Modern understanding of lead toxicity has confirmed and expanded upon what was learned from disasters like Millbrook. We now know that lead is a potent neurotoxin that affects multiple body systems, with the nervous system being particularly vulnerable. Chronic exposure to even small amounts of lead can cause permanent neurological damage, affecting not just vision, but also cognitive function, motor control, and behavior. Children are especially vulnerable because their developing nervous systems are more susceptible to lead's toxic effects, and because they absorb lead more efficiently than adults. The optic nerve damage that affected Millbrook's residents represents one manifestation of lead neurotoxicity. Lead interferes with the normal functioning of nerve cells, disrupts the production and transmission of neural signals, and can cause direct damage to nerve tissue. The optic nerves, which transmit visual information from the eyes to the brain, are particularly vulnerable to this damage. Once optic nerve fibers are destroyed by lead toxicity, they cannot regenerate, making the vision loss permanent and irreversible. Modern medicine has better tools for detecting lead exposure before it causes serious damage. Blood tests can measure lead levels and identify people who have been exposed before symptoms develop. Chelation therapy, a treatment that uses medications to bind and remove heavy metals from the body, can reduce lead levels and prevent further damage if administered before significant toxicity has occurred. But these interventions were not available in the 1870s, and the residents of Millbrook had no way to detect their exposure or to prevent the accumulating damage until it was too late. The economic impacts of the Millbrook disaster extended far beyond the immediate consequences of so many residents losing their vision. The town's reputation was permanently damaged, making it difficult to attract new residents or businesses. Property values plummeted as people sought to sell homes and land in a community associated with tragedy and disability. Agricultural productivity declined as many farmers were blinded, and as those who retained sight found it increasingly difficult to continue operations without the community support structures that had existed before the disaster. Some businesses adapted to serve the needs of the blind population, modifying their operations to make goods and services more accessible to customers and workers without sight. A general store developed systems of organization and labeling that allowed blind customers to shop with minimal assistance. A small workshop was established where blind residents could learn and practice trades like basket weaving and broom making that could be performed without sight, and that provided some income. These adaptations helped somewhat, but they couldn't compensate for the massive economic disruption caused by having nearly half the town's population disabled. The social and cultural life of Millbrook also changed dramatically. Church services adapted to serve a congregation where many members couldn't read hymn books or see the preacher. Social gatherings became more focused on activities that didn't require vision, with music, conversation, and storytelling becoming more central to community life. The town developed its own distinctive culture shaped by the mass blindness, a culture where tactile and auditory information became more important than visual cues, where navigation and orientation relied on sounds and textures rather than sights, where community members became highly attuned to needs of blind neighbors and developed elaborate informal systems for providing assistance. This culture was both adaptive and isolating. It allowed the community to continue functioning despite the catastrophic level of disability, but it also made Millbrook increasingly different from surrounding towns and increasingly insular. People from outside Millbrook often found it unsettling to visit a town where so many residents were blind, where the visual landscape had been modified to serve needs that didn't exist elsewhere, where social interactions followed patterns that seemed strange to those accustomed to sighted communities. This contributed to Millbrook's isolation and to the continued decline in its population, as those who could leave often chose to do so. By the 1890s, 20 years after the disaster, Millbrook had stabilized at a much reduced population of approximately 150 residents. About 80 of these were blind survivors of the contamination, or children who had been born to blind parents. The remaining 70 were sighted residents who had chosen to stay, either because they had strong ties to the community or because they saw opportunities in a town where their sight gave them advantages in employment and business. This small population maintained a marginal existence, neither growing nor completely disappearing, keeping Millbrook alive, but never allowing it to recover what it had lost. The blind residents who survived into old age often reflected on their experiences in letters, interviews, or memoirs that provide insight into how they coped with decades of blindness. Many described the early years as the most difficult when they were still adjusting to vision loss and struggling to develop new skills and ways of functioning. They described frustration, anger, grief for what they had lost, and fear about their futures. But many also described eventual adaptation, finding new sources of meaning and satisfaction, developing abilities and insights they might never have developed if they had remained sighted. Some blind residents became remarkably skilled at navigating without sight, developing sensitivity to environmental cues that allowed them to move through spaces with confidence and independence. They learned to identify locations by sounds, by smells, by the feel of the ground beneath their feet, by subtle changes in air movement and temperature. They became expert at recognizing people by their voices, their footsteps, their distinctive movements and mannerisms. They developed enhanced tactile sensitivity that allowed them to perform skilled work with their hands, creating objects of beauty and utility despite their inability to see what they were making. Others found that their blindness allowed them to develop or strengthen other abilities. Several became skilled musicians, devoting time to practicing instruments and developing musical knowledge that might not have been possible if they had been distracted by visual information. Some became known as wise counselors, people whose lack of sight seemed to enhance their ability to listen deeply and to understand human nature. A few developed reputations as storytellers or poets, using language to create vivid images and experiences for audiences that included both blind and sighted community members. But these successes and adaptations shouldn't obscure the enormous loss and suffering that the Millbrook disaster caused. 217 people lost their vision in a preventable contamination, their lives permanently altered by a substance in their water that could have been detected and eliminated if proper safeguards had been in place. Countless others were affected indirectly. Family members who spent years caring for blind relatives, children who grew up in poverty because their parents couldn't work, entire families whose opportunities and prospects were constrained by the economic and social consequences of the disaster. Marcus Webb continued to practice medicine in Millbrook until his death in 1902 at the age of 68. His later years were marked by continued reflection on the disaster and its causes. In articles and speeches, he advocated for better water safety standards, for regular testing of public water supplies, for removal of potential contamination sources near wells and aquifers. He argued that the Millbrook disaster should serve as a warning about the importance of public health infrastructure and the need for communities to invest in preventing environmental hazards rather than simply reacting after disasters occurred. Webb's advocacy contributed to gradual improvements in water safety practices, though progress was slow and uneven. By the early 20th century, most cities had established systems for testing and treating public water supplies, reducing the risk of contamination from various sources, including lead. That many rural areas, like Millbrook, continued to rely on untested well water for decades longer, remaining vulnerable to contamination that could cause serious harm before being detected. The town of Millbrook itself continued its slow decline through the early 20th century. By 1920, Fewer than 100 residents remained, most of them elderly blind survivors of the 1874 contamination or their descendants. Younger residents increasingly left for opportunities elsewhere, and few new families moved to a community still marked by its tragic history and limited economic prospects. The town's infrastructure deteriorated as the tax base shrank and as resources for maintenance and improvement became scarce. By the 1930s, Millbrook had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning town. The last blind survivors of the contamination had died, their children and grandchildren had mostly departed, and the few remaining residents were scattered across what had once been a coherent community. The town was officially dissolved in 1937, with the remaining population absorbed into neighboring communities, and the name Millbrook disappearing from official maps and records. Today, almost nothing remains of the town that was devastated by lead contamination in 1874. The site where Millbrook once stood is now farmland, with no visible structures or markers indicating that a community of several hundred people once lived there. The cemetery, where many of the blind residents were buried, still exists, though it is overgrown and rarely visited. A few gravestones mark the resting places of people who lost their vision in the disaster, but most graves are unmarked or their markers have deteriorated beyond reading. The only substantial physical reminder of Millbrook's existence is the contaminated well itself, which was sealed with concrete after being closed in 1874, and which still sits beneath the ground at what was once the center of the town. The buried Civil War ammunition that caused the contamination was removed in the 1890s, when concern arose that it might pose ongoing hazards, but the aquifer that fed the well likely remains contaminated with residual lead that will persist for centuries or longer. The historical documentation of the Millbrook disaster is more extensive. Dr. Webb's detailed medical records, preserved in Georgia State Archives, provide a comprehensive account of the contamination and its effects. His case studies of individual patients, his analysis of the progression of blindness, and his observations about how the community responded to mass disability remain valuable resources for researchers interested in lead toxicity, in the social impacts of environmental disasters, and in the history of public health in America. The disaster has also been studied by historians interested in Reconstruction-era Georgia and in how communities coped with catastrophic events in periods of limited governmental support and resources. The Millbrook case provides insights into the vulnerabilities of small southern towns in the 1870s, the limited capacity of state and local governments to respond to public health crises, and the ways that disasters could permanently alter communities that lacked the resilience to recover from major shocks. Modern toxicologists and environmental health researchers occasionally cite the Millbrook case as an early documented example of mass lead poisoning from contaminated water. The case demonstrates how lead contamination can persist undetected for extended periods, how chronic low-level exposure can cause cumulative damage that becomes apparent only after irreversible harm has occurred, and how vulnerable populations are to environmental hazards when water testing and quality control are inadequate or absent. The psychological and social dimensions of the disaster have also attracted scholarly attention. Researchers interested in disability studies have examined how Millbrook adapted to having such a large proportion of its population suddenly blinded, how social structures and cultural practices evolved to accommodate mass disability, and how blind residents developed strategies for maintaining dignity and autonomy in circumstances where they were highly dependent on others. The Millbrook case provides one of the few historical examples of a community forced to completely restructure itself around disability, rather than treating disabled members as exceptions to normal social organization. Some researchers have also noted parallels between the Millbrook disaster and other cases of mass environmental poisoning that have occurred throughout history and continue to occur today. The pattern of slow developing contamination, going unrecognized until extensive damage has occurred, of vulnerable populations bearing the heaviest burden of environmental hazards, of inadequate governmental response, and limited support for affected communities. These patterns have repeated themselves in numerous contexts, from industrial pollution to lead paint exposure to contaminated drinking water in places like Flint, Michigan. The Millbrook disaster reminds us that environmental hazards often develop gradually rather than suddenly, that by the time patterns become obvious, significant harm may already have occurred, and that protecting public health requires active monitoring and intervention rather than assuming resources are safe until proven otherwise. It demonstrates the importance of maintaining infrastructure, of properly disposing of hazardous materials, and of remaining vigilant about potential contamination sources that may not become apparent until years or decades after they are created. The case also raises difficult questions about responsibility and compensation when disasters result from circumstances that no individual or organization deliberately created. The lead contamination in Millbrook's water came from military ordnance buried during wartime, gradually leaching into groundwater over a decade. No one planned or intended this contamination, yet it caused devastating harm to hundreds of people. How should such situations be addressed? Who bears responsibility for prevention and for compensation when harm occurs? These questions remain relevant today as communities continue to discover legacy contamination from past activities and struggle with how to address the consequences. Perhaps most poignantly, the Millbrook disaster reminds us of the fragility of communities and of how quickly catastrophe can transform thriving towns into ghost towns. Millbrook was not a wealthy community, but it was functioning and stable before the contamination occurred. Within 2 years of discovering the lead in their water, the town was in catastrophic decline. Within 20 years, it was barely surviving. Within 60 years, it had disappeared entirely. The speed with which a community can be destroyed by environmental disaster is sobering and should inform how we think about protecting the communities we live in today. The 217 people who lost their vision in Millbrook lived the rest of their lives in darkness, their futures stolen by contaminated water they had trusted to be safe. Some adapted and found new ways to live meaningful lives. Others struggled until their deaths with the loss of independence, opportunity, and connection that blindness imposed on them. All of them paid a terrible price for a disaster that should never have happened, that could have been prevented with better practices and stronger protections. Their stories, preserved in Dr. Webb's medical records and in the scattered historical documents that survive, stand as testimony to what can happen when communities lack the resources and knowledge to protect themselves from environmental hazards. They remind us that public health infrastructure, water safety regulations, and environmental monitoring are not luxuries, but necessities, that the costs of maintaining these protections are trivial compared to the human suffering that results when they fail or are absent. The Millbrook disaster also demonstrates the inadequacy of simply identifying problems after harm has occurred. By the time the lead contamination was discovered and the well was closed, over 100 people had already been irreversibly blinded, and many more were already exposed to levels of lead that would eventually destroy their vision. Earlier detection through regular water testing might have prevented most or all of these cases, but in the 1870s, such testing was not routine, and communities like Millbrook had no way to know their water was dangerous until the consequences became undeniable. Today, we have better tools and better understanding of environmental health threats. We can test water supplies for a wide range of contaminants. We have established safety standards for acceptable levels of various substances. We have systems for monitoring and responding to contamination when it occurs. But these protections are not universal, are not always adequately funded or enforced, and remain vulnerable to being undermined by those who view them as obstacles to economic activity rather than as essential safeguards for public health. The Millbrook disaster, long forgotten by most people and erased from the landscape where it occurred, still has lessons to teach us about the importance of protecting water supplies, about the devastating consequences when we fail to do so, and about how quickly disaster can destroy communities that lack resilience and support. The blind town of Georgia, the community that lost half its population to contaminated water, serves as a warning from history about what happens when we take our basic resources for granted and fail to maintain the vigilance necessary to protect them. What do you think about this case? Could better oversight have prevented the Millbrook disaster? What responsibilities do communities and governments have to protect water supplies? What does this case tell us about how we respond to environmental disasters and support affected populations? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.